right. Let's go ahead and get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. That was a little weak. Let's try that one more time. Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, okay, that was fantastic. So I'd like to welcome you all here. I want to also extend a special welcome to those of you who are watching live, courtesy of our streaming folks at Channel 9. And I can't tell you how so excited I am to be here once again, presenting yet another tips and tricks session on Exchange. How many of you have seen one of these before? All right. How many of you saw the first one I ever did slightly more than 20 years ago? It wasn't called Tips and Tricks then. It was called Trench Tales and Resource Gold Mines. Anyone here who saw that? Are all those people dead now? I guess so. All right, it's just me. Okay, well, welcome. As I said, this is the Exchange 2013 Tips and Tricks session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Schnall. I'm a principal technical writer on the Exchange team. Among other things, I write the product documentation for storage, store, virtualization, high availability, site resilience, disaster recovery, some of the deployment work, and a couple other areas as well. And if you haven't been to one of these sessions before, it's really just a whole bunch of tips that I decided that I think it's important for you to know these kinds of things. Sometimes there are things that, no one's talking about or might not be documented or documented yet. But in this case, I'm going to try to fill in some of the gaps on some of the content that we dropped on you earlier in this session. For example, how many of you were in Ross's managed availability session earlier this week? Fantastic, a large part of you. And so I'm going to fill in some of those gaps and show you some of the command line things that you can do in PowerShell to really understand what managed availability is doing. So there's kind of a free flow here. The agenda is just going to go across the spectrum of areas, and we're going to start out with the just kind of the basics. So for those of you who don't really know too much about Exchange 2013 or haven't had a chance to really dig into it or deploy it, I just want to sort of level set stuff. There are a couple slides in here that you may have seen in Robert's migration and coexistence session yesterday, but I wanted to revisit them first, of course, for the online audience who wasn't there, and second, to discuss a couple more things in detail as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is the editions that are available. So when we have a product like Exchange Server, we develop in multiple editions, or SKUs, what we sometimes call. As with previous versions, and by previous I mean 2010 and 2007, we have two primary editions, the Standard Edition and the Enterprise Edition. The only difference between those two products, the only difference between those licenses or those editions, is the fact that Standard is limited to 5 databases per server, Enterprise goes to 50 databases per server. And, of course, that's going to change. In CU2, as we announced earlier, we are upping the limit on Enterprise from 50 databases to 100 databases in the Enterprise Edition. Now, when we talk about databases and the maximum number that are supported, we're talking about mounted databases. Now, for those of you who are using database availability groups, you know that primarily there's two types of databases, an active database and a passive database. And we count both of those when we count mounted databases. For instance, a database could be mounted as an active database, mounted for in-use by clients. Or it could be mounted in recovery by the replication service as a passive database as well. Now, that is the limit of number of mountable databases. There's actually a different limit as well, the number of maximum databases that you can create. On any server, including the Standard Edition, you could create up to 235 databases. But you will only be able to mount the maximum given to you by your license key. That's either going to be 5 or 50 pre-CU2 or 100 post-CU2 in the Enterprise Edition. So I want to be super clear, it's mounted databases. You can create many more databases, but this is the maximum number that you can mount given that edition. All right. Now, there's also this third edition, this hybrid edition, and this was actually a third edition that we first introduced in Exchange 2010 as a sort of a gatekeeper to connect an on-premises environment to Office 365. Now, there is an Exchange 2013 hybrid server as well, but depending on what version of Exchange your organization is running, you may or may not need that hybrid server. The Exchange 2013 hybrid server is largely for Exchange 2007 and Exchange 2010 organizations that want to do a hybrid configuration with Office 365 or that want to move to Office 365 completely. If your organization is native Exchange 2013, and you want to do a hybrid configuration or also migrate to the cloud, well, then you don't need a special hybrid edition key. And that is because the Exchange 2013 version of the hybrid server is basically built in. 2013 has these native hybrid capabilities such that we don't need a special license key when we're talking a 2013 organization. You'll only need that for a 2007 or 2010 organization. And basically, that's nothing more than just downloading Exchange 2010, or Exchange 2013 rather, whatever the latest version is. Could be CU1 if it's today, CU2 later on this summer. You download that version, and once you have a trial key, you are already up and running. You don't need to call the Office 365 support line to request a free key like you do with the other versions. All right, now I know Robert talked a little bit about cumulative updates, but I do just want to reinforce some stuff because based on what I saw on Twitter and some of the forums, there may be some confusion as to how we're distributing them. So we've said pretty clearly, I think, that we will be distributing updates quarterly. And that, of course, is 4 times a year. But some folks have taken that a little too literally to mean that's going to be exactly on the dot every 3 months. Or exactly 3 months from the time the first one was released, the next one's going to come out. So recognizing that a quarter is actually a 3-month period and that we'll have quarterly updates, we could, in fact, release an update in the first month of one quarter and the last month of the next quarter as well. So don't expect necessarily a 3-month exact gap in between the release of cumulative updates. I want to be super clear about that. And as we also talked about yesterday, and I know there was a question about quality control given some of the history we had with our recent roll-up updates for Exchange 2010, I want to stress the fact that before these updates are released, and in fact before they're deployed in Office 365, they are going through very extensive testing. I know Ross talked quite a bit about some of the things we've done to sort of step up our game in terms of expanding our test coverage and making sure that things are really nailed down before they get shipped. So we've done all that stuff internally, and then beyond that, we're going to deploy into the service first. So when we think this update is ready to be deployed, we are going to be the first ones to deploy it. Okay, we'll deploy it in our own dog food production environments, and we will deploy it in the service first. So before you ever get to download it, or I should say by the time you get to download it, this will be very vetted, very well-exercised code. Again, just to show you the scale in Office 365 right now, we've got well over 150 million mailboxes. So this will be very well-exercised and vetted code. Now, we've also talked about the security updates. Now, there are no planned right now, but if we ever need to issue security updates, they will not be dependent on a particular cumulative update version. We will release security update versions for all of these supported cumulative updates that are out there now. So, for instance, right now, both RTM and CU1 deployments are supported. And if we had a security update, we would release a version that could be deployed on RTM and a separate second version that could be deployed on CU1. In other words, we're not going to force you to go to the later CU1 in order to get your security updates. In terms of cumulative update support, we have used the 3-month time frame. We have said that we will support a CU in production for a period of 3 months after the next CU is released. So again, if we are looking at perhaps a 3 to perhaps as long as a 5.5 or 6 month gap in between CU releases, that could be a support period that, of course, could be around 9 months or so. So a very long support period for one of those updates. And of course, that's just the support period. That doesn't mean things are going to turn off or break or anything like that. Now, the CUs really represent a new model. The way we historically delivered Exchange as a product is we would develop it and we would do internal testing, we would spin up a TAP program and send builds to TAP customers and give them beta builds and whatnot. And generally that, as you saw from the last few releases before 2013, that was largely a 3-year cycle. 2007 came out in late 2006, 2010 came out in late 2009, 2013 came out in late 2012. So what has changed now is that our cadence has shortened. Our development cycle has shortened. We are now releasing the updates more along a milestone path, with RTM only being the first milestone in a series of milestones of our product release cycle. So CU1 would be another one of those milestones. CU2 is our next milestone, and so forth. Okay, so with this new development cadence, what that means is that the features and functionalities are coming in little bits and pieces as they are rolled out in updates. So you don't have to have this big, huge package of all these new and different things that comes in, like perhaps we've done historically in a service pack or other major version updates. Now you have control over these packages. And as I mentioned, because of the data center scale validation, you'll know that they've been very well tested before you ever even go to install them in your labs, let alone your production environments. And of course, there are just a couple differences between the cumulative updates and roll-up updates. You could think of CUs as very similar to service packs, although they are not service packs. But you could think of them that way because the behavior that they do is very similar. The setup behavior removes the product that's there and puts down the whole new product of the updated version, just like a service pack. The setup program will remove any customized config files that might be on the product, on the server, and replace them with new ones from the updated bits, just like a service pack would. And the uninstall process is just like a service pack. It's not a separate update. You're actually uninstalling Exchange from the box, which, as an aside, I realized as we were saying that to customers, we want them to be clear, particularly those of you who may be deploying stuff in a lab and maybe you're only testing one server. If you run into a situation where you uninstall the last server in your organization because of one of these service packs or cumulative updates or a failure or something like that, you'll actually be removing your Exchange organization. So you want to be careful about that as well. And as I mentioned, we will be incrementing the server version number. So if you're looking in the Exchange Admin Center or if you're doing Get Exchange version through PowerShell, we will increment the server build number with every cumulative update. So you will be able to have better tracking of that stuff as well. All right, let's talk about some general stuff. This may come as a surprise to some of you as to how many things that have been in Exchange for such a long time that are simply gone. Okay? Things like the legacy client access role. Yes, we have a client access server role in 2013. Hopefully you got to go see Greg's session where he described a lot about that. But the client access server we have in 2013 is nothing like the client access server we had in 2010 or 2007. All of that functionality as a separate server role is gone. And in fact, it's integrated now into the mailbox server. So the functionality is present, but it's no longer a separate server role. And of course, same thing with the hub transport server role and the unified messaging server roles. They are just gone from a server role perspective. And this consolidation actually helped us out quite a bit through things like better and easier deployment, better high availability, and a superior site resilience story over Exchange 2010 as well. But even other big things like the Exchange Management Console, the MMC stamping, it's just gone. Same with the Exchange Control Panel, which we just introduced in Exchange 2010. That is gone as a separate element. So is RPC over TCP connectivity for Outlook clients. This is interesting because I've noticed that some folks, when we talk about this, they mistakenly believe that that means MAPI is gone. That is not the case. MAPI is absolutely there. It's just RPC using TCP as the transport protocol is no longer in use. We are now using RPC over HTTP only, or what we branded as Outlook Anywhere, as our transport protocol. But though, make no mistake, those RPC packets are MAPI packets. So MAPI is still being used. Support for Outlook 2003, hopefully not such a big deal. Hopefully most of you, or maybe even all of you, are no longer using such an old client like that. The legacy information store. The information store that existed in Exchange 4.0 and was carried all the way forward into Exchange 2010 is gone and completely replaced with a brand new store that we call the Managed Store. I'll talk a little bit about the Managed Store in a bit. Also, the legacy database caching algorithm. How many of you are familiar with that database caching algorithm that we had in previous versions of Exchange? The dynamic buffer algorithm is what it was called. Gee, only 2 hands went up. Well, let me ask you this question. How many of you are familiar with, help, the store is eating all of my memory? There you go. There it is. Yeah, that's the dynamic buffer algorithm. And that's a good thing because that's why you bought the memory, so it could be used. But we actually found an even better way of doing it in the newer version as well. I'll talk a little bit about that too. Microsoft Search, we used that in both 2007 and 2010. It's gone and completely replaced with Search Foundation, a brand new search engine that we acquired from a company called Fast in Norway. And in fact, we acquired not just their technology, but their people as well. So that team still is in Oslo and still is supporting and maintaining Search Foundation, which has been the standardized now search engine that we're using across Office. So SharePoint and Exchange share that search engine now as well. And they also share a federated search API to make searching across those platforms even easier. Things like public folder databases. Public folder databases has also been around forever. They are now gone, and with them things like public folder replication. Of course, we have modern public folders, but those are mailboxes now, not public folder databases. Now, here's one that I'm actually personally bummed about, the Exchange Server Best Practices Analyzer. How many of you are familiar with that tool? All right, yeah. That was actually the first tool I worked on when I joined Microsoft 9 years ago. And in fact, if you read the content in that tool, most of that was written personally by me. So I'm a little, I have a little sorrow over the loss of this. But we have taken some of what BPA used to do, and we have put it into the setup program, and we have put it into a couple other places in Exchange. So we still do have some of that functionality in there. It's just not a separate tool that you will run. It's possible that tool may come back one day. I'm not making any promises, but it's possible. Also gone, the legacy Outlook web app. And by legacy, I mean the one that we just rewrote and introduced in Exchange 2010, which replaced the brand new one that we rewrote and introduced in Exchange 2007. We seem to have this thing for rewriting OA with every release. But that's okay, because we've done some very innovative things with this version of Outlook web app that are specifically tailored towards slates, tablets, mobile devices, and just about any other form factor that's new in this day and age. And of course, a lot of the features that went with that legacy OA are gone with it. Things like S-MIME, the bottom reading pane, replying to messages sent as attachments, that's gone, unfortunately. Some of these might come back. It's possible maybe S-MIME might come back one day. Again, no promises, but it is possible. The virus scanning API is also gone. Sometimes this was known as VSAPI, other times it was known as the AV API, Antivirus API. Eventually we settled on VSAPI, but VSAPI is gone. And what that means is that was the antivirus API and the hooks inside of the information store that we would allow third-party vendors to integrate their applications into. So that is gone, that API is gone, and with it, all third-party access directly into the store is gone with it as well. And that might sound like a bummer if you're using one of those third-party applications, but that's actually a really good thing, because that means that you don't have third parties going in there and doing potentially unexpected or unwanted things inside your information store. Okay, so that's a very good thing. And if you're a little worried about not running third-party antivirus software on your servers, you can still do that. We have built-in antivirus and anti-malware in Exchange, and that can be augmented with or completely replaced by a third-party product that doesn't use VSAPI, but uses one of our other methods like Exchange Web Services or transport scanning to provide that functionality for you. So the functionality is still there. Just this one API and the hooks into the store are gone. Managed folders are gone. Also, the ability to remove individual server roles is also gone as well. So if you've deployed a multi-role server, you've got CAS and Mailbox on the same role, later on you decide you want to split out CAS and have it be on a separate server and remove it from that Mailbox server, we don't right now have that plumb for you to be able to do that. You would actually have to just, excuse me, install CAS on another server and just leave the other CAS instance there. Excuse me. Or if you really wanted to remove it, you would have to actually just uninstall the server and then reinstall just the Mailbox role as well. You cannot do a server recovery operation because that will basically recreate the box for you. All right. There's also the lookups. For those of you using Unified Messaging, when you were doing the lookups, directory lookups, using speech recognition, unfortunately that is also gone in Exchange 2013 as well. But it's okay, because all that stuff that's gone made way for all this awesome stuff that is new. Like the new server role architecture. How many of you have familiarized yourself with that? Just 2 server roles. Every server is an island. Our key tenant is that access to a mailbox is always through the protocol stack on whatever mailbox server hosts the active copy of that user's mailbox. That is all very key and very important principles that you need to understand about 2013, about how it's different from all of its predecessors. Also the client access server. Yes, it's the same name as what we had before, but it is very different from any version of CAS we've ever had. This is a light, thin proxy. It's just a protocol proxy, whereas before, CAS was a full middle-tier RPC, data rendering, storing, etc. Application server. It's not anymore. It's just a thin, lightweight proxy. The managed store, as I mentioned, that replaces the information store. That we call it the managed store because it's written in managed code, C#. And we now use a worker process model as well. So we don't have that monolithic, that single store process, which, could be a really bad point of failure when you think about it in the previous versions. Now we've got a multi-process model. For each database that gets mounted by the system, it will have its own dedicated store worker process to it. And that own dedicated store worker process will also be responsible for providing the RPC endpoint for that database and responsible for providing the ESC database cache for that database as well. And I mentioned that we don't use that dynamic caching algorithm anymore, that dynamic buffer algorithm. We now have a static cache formula that we calculate only on store startup. And because we calculate it only on store startup, it's based on the number of databases that are on the server and mounted. And based on their active or passive capabilities, that depends on how much memory they're going to get assigned at startup. But that brings to it not just simplicity, but it also allowed us to remove a large amount of complex and old nested code that was that dynamic buffer algorithm. But unfortunately, there is one minor side effect that you want to be aware of. And that is, of course, if you are adding databases or removing databases or adding or removing database copies, you will need to restart the information store when you've done that so that it can recalculate the database cache. Now, if you don't do that, what that means is some of your databases are going to be underserved by cache, and they're going to perform very poorly. Okay? Nothing should break, but you're going to get very poor performance. Once you restart the store, it will recognize databases have been added or that the configuration has changed, and it will statically recalculate the amount of memory needed for the databases that are present there. And you'll notice, for those of you who make your database or database copies inside the Exchange Admin Center, we do now, starting with CU1, pop up a little dialog reminding you of that. Shouldn't be too big of a deal because, quite frankly, when you're doing those sorts of operations, it's typically during a maintenance or a setup or deployment period anyway, so restarting a store process is really not a big deal. Now, managed availability, that is also brand new. And managed availability is there extending high availability basically to everywhere outside the DAG. So that's every single component in Exchange. That could be web services, Outlook web app, offline address book, it could be RPC, client access, it could be data protection for the services that are required for replication, it could be the Active Directory dependencies, it could be DNS. Everything that goes into making Exchange work on a second-by-second basis is now being managed and monitored by managed availability. Hundreds of things are happening every second on both server roles with managed availability now. And I know Ross talked about it a little bit, but later on I'm going to show you some PowerShell things that you can do to really get some rich information out of the managed availability Crimson channel. Search Foundation, I mentioned that's the new search engine that we used. Again, that replaces Microsoft Search. We have a brand new Outlook web app that we've introduced. I'll show you some cool tricks that you can do there. We've introduced data loss prevention, which is based on transport rules. It takes transport rules and policies and reporting and packages them all up into these nice little policy templates that allow you to quickly create policies that can be enforced on your mail users and protect sensitive data from being sent outside your organization. Things like credit card numbers, driver's license numbers, banking information, social security numbers, all those kinds of things can be trapped and caught in email and stopped from being leaked through your messaging system. In-place hold and in-place discovery, those are evolutions of the hold and discovery features that we introduced in Exchange 2010. We do have new names, though. We call them in-place hold and in-place e-discovery to reinforce the fact that the data remains wherever it is. In SharePoint if it's in SharePoint, in Link if it's in Link, in Exchange if it's in Exchange. That hold and that discovery is all done in place without the need for external tools or external repositories. That's a huge benefit over previous versions. Of course, integration with SharePoint and Link, we have that all over the place. Some of you may have already experienced that in previous versions with our link integration and the presence information you see in earlier versions of Office, like Office 2010. But we've gone beyond that by introducing features like a site mailbox, which is, as its name implies, a combination of a SharePoint site and an Exchange mailbox. So I could create a site for a team or for a project that's being worked on. And when I send email messages with attachments to that site, it will strip off the emails and strip off the attachments and store them in the SharePoint site. And then the email will just have links to those attachments that are stored in there. And both SharePoint and Exchange provide a doorway into the same content. So whichever interface you prefer working in, Outlook or SharePoint, you have a way to get to your team's documents. And it's a great way to collaborate while allowing to use the document property and other version control and other features of SharePoint, with the storage and email and collaboration capabilities of Exchange. We also have the Unified Contact Store, so those of you who have integrated Link with your Exchange deployments, we can take your Link contacts and store them inside your Exchange mailbox as well. And of course, that has the benefit of having those contacts not only follow you around wherever you go, but because it's in your mailbox, they're also being backed up as well and highly protected. And we can archive Link content as well, so that is just not your conversations, but meetings as well can be archived through Link. Built-in anti-malware protection, I talked about that already. Batch mailbox moves, that's something that's new and improved. Of course, in Exchange 2010, we introduced the ability to do these online move mailboxes. But in 2010, it was kind of a babysitting activity where you really had to watch and make sure that the mailboxes were moved without corruption and things completed successfully, and that especially if you were doing it over an evening or a weekend, that users could get back into their mailboxes come the next morning. And so what we've done now is we've given you a finer control over doing these migrations in batch. Instead of just sending all the data over your network, you can control how many moves are done at the same time, which moves are done, and so forth. And we not only gave you this control through new commandlets that we introduced, but we also gave you a UI inside the Exchange Admin Center so that you can do it through there as well. The namespace options, I talked a lot about that in my site resilience session. I know Greg talked quite a bit about that in his client access server session. So if you didn't get to see that, I highly recommend going and downloading the deck and watching that recording as well. We've also introduced modern public folders. How many of you are using modern or public folders today? Any kind of public folders? All right. How many of you plan on using public folders in 2013? All right. How many of you don't want to use public folders ever again? All right. Okay, well, the great news is this. Public folders in 2013 are completely optional. Because we dropped support for Outlook 2003, there are no supported clients that require public folders. Therefore, no deployment of Exchange on the planet technically requires public folders from a product or client standpoint. But if you do want to deploy them, they're all new and very different and very cool. They've been modernized, hence the name, modern public folders. They're now a type of mailbox that you deploy. And I'm going to show you some tips around public folders, particularly around managing them from the command line, because we've got a bunch of new stuff for you to do, including new things that we just introduced in CU1 that are different from what we did in RTM. We also have in the unified messaging stack enhanced caller ID. So previously with the caller ID in UM, we would only do an Active Directory lookup. Now we have the ability to also look at your contact list as well and see if the number that someone is calling from is in your contact list. And this could be a shared contact list. This could be a secondary contact list. This could be a linked contact list. Or it could be a combination of all that, as long as you have that contact in there. And that could also be external contacts that are integrated into your internal contacts through our LinkedIn integration and our other social integration as well. So now you've got way better caller ID than we ever had before in 2010. And workload management. This is also mostly new in 2013. Not entirely. We had a variation of this in Exchange 2010. We called it client and user throttling back then. But now it's really holistic, looking at the entire system and really doing full workload management. So whereas managed availability has its eye on the availability of services and the user experience, workload management is looking at the ongoing workload on the box and the resources that are available. So workload management also has the ability to throttle back operations that may be happening, but it also, based on resources on the box and whatever activity is going on, it also is in control of when many background operations happen. So there's a lot of background operations that typically happen on an Exchange server. Sometimes we refer to that as internal maintenance, things like cleaning up the store or going in and reconciling disconnected accounts with Active Directory and so forth, those kinds of things. They all now run as throttled assistants under workload management. So all that work still gets done, but now it has some intelligence around when that work should be done based on the resources that are available on the box. And there's really too much for one slide. There's way more new stuff than we have time to talk about. So go check out that URL, and you'll read about all this other goodness that we have in 2013. I also want to get you connected. For those of you who aren't connected, I want to invite you to join the Exchange community. We're a very thriving community. We have a very long history. Some of us have been around in this community for more than 2 decades, even though some won't admit that, like me. But yeah, some of us are really old, and we've been doing this for a long time. But we want to connect you in. We want more people. This is an inclusive community. So check out our team blog. How many of you have not been to our team blog? Have not? Excellent. Almost everybody's been there. That's great. Share it with your friends. Go to our RT Pro forums. Those are hosted on TechEd. Those are where you'll see me and other people from the Exchange team and Office 365 and customer support answering all of your questions. Go to the developer forums and get your developer forums answered. Or subscribe to our RSS feeds that we just created for Exchange 2013 KBs. So as soon as we issue a KB, you'll get it in your RSS feed and you'll be aware of new issues that we're publishing out to TechNet and the Support Center. And there's also a number of thriving third-party forums as well. We don't have a monopoly on the forums. There's many, many thriving ecosystems out there that are all related to Exchange. Some on Google, some on LinkedIn, some on Exchange Server Pro, some on ExchangeExchange.com, and some on many other areas as well. I highly recommend connecting in because this is the web of information that will tell you things that you might not necessarily learn at one of these events or read in one of the TechNet articles or on a blog post that we publish. And there's also Office 365 forums as well. Now, in terms of downloads, there's a bunch of downloads you're going to want to bookmark. Things like our Exchange documentation. We update that once a month. And in fact, we also have the ability to do weekly or daily updating to TechNet as needed. But once a month, we'll release an updated compiled HTML help file with the most recent version of the Exchange 2013 help file in it. DLP policy templates. For those of you who got a chance to see Bharat's compliance session, he talked and showed some of the DLP policy templates that are built into Exchange. Well, there's also some updates to those that you'll want to go and get if you're using DLP, and you can go to that link to get them. Office Visio stencils, those are handy for those of you who have to create network diagrams and want to include the new shapes and stencils that we have for Exchange 2013. SharePoint 2013, Link 2013, Office 2013, and Office 365. Those have all been updated and freshened. And then the UN language packs and the Exchange Web Services managed APIs as well. So for those of you who are doing UM, or if you're doing some EWS development against Exchange, you're going to want to get that API. All right, let's talk a little bit about PowerShell. So we talked about what's gone generally, but there's also a lot of PowerShell things that are gone, particularly over Exchange 2010 as well. Things like commandlets related to the RPC client access, because that's not an object that you need to deal with anymore in Exchange 2013. An object doesn't exist, so we don't need those commandlets. Some of the routing group connectors and the team mailboxes, other features that simply don't exist anymore, the commandlets went away with them as well. Obviously, if you are coexisting Exchange 2013 with the legacy version like Exchange 2010, you still have the ability to use the Exchange 2010 Exchange Management Shell to use and execute these commandlets against your 2010 servers. But there's also a lot of new stuff, and I'm not going to list them all because there's literally almost 300 more commandlets in Exchange 2013 than there were in Exchange 2010. Almost 300 more, and more are being added all the time. We added some new ones in between RTM and CU1, and there will be some new properties that will be coming in CU2, and possibly some new commandlets as well. So keep that in mind. Now, let's talk about tools. There's a lot of tools that you're going to want to be aware of when it comes to not just sizing or planning for Exchange, but you also want to have some tools out there for managing it as well. So I've actually progressed them. The order in which we're going to do them are typically the order in which you might use them. So one of the first things that you're going to do is use our server sizing guidance. Now, this is a blog post that we just released, and it's about to make its way into TechNet as well, so that you'll have it in that help file that I just talked about. But basically, the sizing guidance that we have for Exchange 2013, the steps that you'll do are very similar to what you do for Exchange 2010, but the assumptions, the values, the figures, the tools, and everything else is different because of all the native differences inside Exchange 2013. But you're still going to be doing things like gathering data about your existing environment if you have an Exchange environment that already exists. You're still going to be determining whatever requirements affect sizing, not just your mailboxes, but other features that you might want to take advantage of that also have storage implications. You need to calculate the requirements for Exchange. You need to do all that scale and resiliency requirements, and you need to basically gather a lot of information to get all of that information, to get your design done just right. Now, Jeff Miliff, who is one of the PMs in this area, he had a great session on sizing Exchange, so if you missed that, I would invite you to go back and see that. And of course, in that session, Jeff mentioned the server role requirements calculator, which is one of the key and necessary tools for calculating how your Exchange server should be sized from a hardware perspective. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with the mailbox server role requirements calculator that we had in 2010 and the storage calculator that we introduced in 2007. Well, it's got a new name now because it's doing all of the server role stuff. Remember, the mailbox server's not just mailbox anymore. It's got it's got hub, it's got CAS in there as well. So all of the sizing guidelines that we had for 2010, all of those values that we used, the base platform that we used, everything has changed. You cannot use any of the 2010 stuff for sizing 2013. Use only the 2013 stuff, which will be evolving as well. In fact, since we released it, we've already had one update to it that we've posted as well. You can go and download it from that link. I would strongly recommend reading the README before you proceed. And of course, if you have any feedback on it whatsoever, you're curious about something, you found a bug or something not working right, send it to that alias and it will go right to the team that develops the calculator. Okay? One thing I'll say, though, is if you are getting unpredictable or unexpected results in your calculator, when you do submit your feedback and you are asking for help on that, include a copy of the calculator so that the team can analyze your calculations and figure out what might be going wrong. If you forget to do that, I guarantee that's the first thing they're going to ask you for when they follow up on your response. All right, Jet Stress. How many of you have heard of this tool? It is not new. It's very old. Excellent, excellent. This is another tool that we've updated for Exchange 2013. This is another one of those must-have tools. This tool is there to validate your storage environment prior to going into production. Do not do it after production because it will make a mess of your production environment. It is for pre-production storage subsystem validation only. Okay? And that is version specific. So if we make any changes in the product that may require changes in Jet Stress, we will release an updated version of Jet Stress. But right now, as of today, version 658.4 is the build that you would use on both RTM and CU1 validation. And again, even though we're talking about RTM, really hopefully most of you are on CU1 because that would be the preferred deployment today. The Exchange Deployment Assistant, how many of you have heard of this tool? All right, not as many as Jet Stress, but of course that's not a surprise because Jet Stress has been around much longer than EDA. Well, the Exchange Deployment Assistant is pretty much your shortcut around TechNet in terms of the actual deployment process. It's a website that you go to, aka.ms/exdeploy, and when you're on that website, you choose the scenario. The scenario could be an on-premises deployment, it could be a hybrid deployment, or it could be a pure cloud Office 365 only deployment. And once you choose that path, you'll just answer 3 or 4 questions, and next thing you know, the tool is giving you step-by-step instructions for deploying and configuring everything, getting mail flow up and running, getting your users connected, getting permissions and certificates right, getting DNS configured, and every other step that you'd have to do, that you'd have to read about separately in TechNet to find out how to do it. It's all in one nice little place for you. And of course, if you're doing a hybrid, it will give you everything you need to know about hybrid. It will walk you through the steps, giving you, again, step-by-step instructions. And what's really great about this tool is in addition to the step-by-step instructions, at the end there's this how do you know it works section. So we also give you the steps to validate that what you just did completed successfully and you are in fact ready to move on to the next step. So it's a fantastic thing. You can print out the checklist. We use Silverlight so we can persist where you are. So if you leave the website and go back to it later on, you'll go right back to where you were the last time that you were there. You could email the checklist. Again, I mentioned earlier, you could print it, which means you could take it to a disconnected environment. If your Exchange servers don't have internet access for whatever reason, you could take that and deploy it that way as well. Now, the Remote Connectivity Analyzer. How many of you have heard of this tool? All right, more people. We're trying to do a lot of work around buzz around this tool because it's almost like having someone from CSS right there with you when you're troubleshooting some of these issues. It can look at things like Auto Discover. It can look at things like Outlook Anywhere, Exchange Web Services, certificates, SMTP, both inbound and outbound. And basically from this external perspective, because it is a web service, it will verify connectivity for your organization. And of course, we also have the Microsoft Connectivity Analyzer, which is a downloadable version that you would run internally and verify internal connectivity as well. Now, one of the new things that we've recently done with the Connectivity Analyzer is we've included this new Message Analyzer. It's still in beta, so when you go to this website and you try it out, you'll see it still says beta. But basically what you can do is you can take the headers from an email message and paste it into this Message Analyzer, and it will break down the headers line by line and show you all the path and everything that went on with that message. What gateways it went through, what IP addresses they had, how long it took, et cetera, et cetera. So you really can trace the entire pathway of the message without having to just look at the headers and start reading line by yourself. You just paste it in and boom, you get your analysis just like that. It's very fast and very handy. And of course, because it's in beta, we would love to have your feedback on it as well. So even if it might be something that you don't see yourself using every day, it'd be great to have you go and try it and see what you think of it. So feel free to send us feedback on that as well. And then the Exchange 2013 Management Pack. How many of you are using System Center Operations Manager? All right, so that's what the Management Pack is for. It's for System Center operations. As Ross described in his managed availability session, the way in which we do the management pack is very, very different. There's no root cause analysis. There's no correlation engine trying to put things together and figure out what the problem was. It is really there just to be somewhat of a listener for the managed availability escalations that are coming to it via the event log. Now, we have exposed the health sets that we have in managed availability to System Center. So if you wanted a quick at-a-glance view of what the overall health of an individual server or one of the managed availability health sets is, you can do that very quickly and easily inside of SCOM with this management pack. Clearly, SCOM is the best experience for you when you want to see what's happening with managed availability. But if you don't have System Center, there's other ways to get that information as well. For instance, the escalation path that we use, that's nothing more than generating an event log. So any tool that you're using that's collecting event logs from a server could pick up that event log and notify an administrator just the same way we notify SCOM. You might not have those beautiful alert displays that we put work into, but you will get the escalations if you are collecting event logs. So if you are using the System Center Operations Manager, you definitely want to go get the Exchange 2013 Management Pack to manage your 2013 servers. All right, the next one is the Office Configuration Analyzer tool, and this one is semi-new. It actually replaces an older tool called the Outlook Configuration Analyzer tool. And basically what it does is it looks for now not just Outlook, but also Office programs. Excel, Access, PowerPoint, Word. It's looking at all those programs for common configuration errors. Okay, so maybe some registry entry was changed, or one of the DLLs got moved, or something is different. It's not a standard install anymore. Something has changed. This tool can go ahead and analyze it and let you know if something is non-standard or if something is not configured properly. That might affect the user experience as well. So for those of you who tried OCAT, which was the old Outlook version of this, try OffCat, because the Outlook version of it was awesome. It fixed a whole bunch of things related to bad profiles or things around misconfigurations in the registry and so forth, like missing keys and missing values. But now the OffCat tool does that for all the Office applications as well, or all the ones that are listed here as well. All right, and there is one more. It's not something that you can download or something that you can get, but I did want to mention for those of you customers who have MCS engagements. Starting with Exchange 2010 and continuing in Exchange 2013, Microsoft Consulting Services has started to develop what we call product line architectures for our products. So we have a product line architecture, or PLA as we call it, for Exchange, and we have one for Lync, and we're working on ones for other products as well. And basically what it is, it's an MCS service that you can purchase with an engagement, and it will basically give you our recommended practice approach to designing Exchange. So all of the things that we tell you to do in TechEd, all of the things that we tell you from a guidance perspective, we have encoded into this product line architecture offering that we have from MCS. And so for those of you who are the larger enterprise customers in here that have MCS engagements, talk to your MCS representative about the Exchange 2013 PLA, especially if you have not deployed yet, because it can give you a smoother deployment, an accelerated deployment, increased quality, and note that we target a 99.9% service level target as well. So that is a very high level of service that you would get out of deploying Exchange the way this product line architecture tells you. So think of it as a reference architecture that you can acquire in tandem with MCS to help you with your deployments, to help you really get it right at an accelerated rate. All right, let's talk about information workers and calendaring. I mentioned there were some cool new things in Outlook Web App and how we've changed things. Well, one of the neat things that we've done about Outlook Web App is that we now understand the device on which we're being displayed. And so based on that understanding, we present now one of 3 different views of Outlook Web App, depending on whether you're using a desktop computer, or if you have a slate or a tablet, or if you happen to have a mobile device like a phone or so forth. So if you just go to your Outlook Web App site in Exchange 2013, you get that traditional 3-column view that you're used to. You have your trees, you have your messages, and then you've got your reading pane. With the other views, we might drop off 1 or 2 of those columns. The 2-column gives you your messages and the reading view, and then the ability to collapse and expand the pane. And then the 1 column is just all of your messages, which is basically what you would see if you went to Outlook Web App using a mobile device. We also have recognition for devices that wouldn't support one of these views as well. And so for those devices, you would simply inherit automatically what we call the light version of Outlook Web App. And in fact, if you've tried to go to OWA on some of your mobile devices, you may have already experienced that as well. Now, what's also interesting is you can change this view on the fly simply by manipulating the URL. All you need to do is add the !/layout equals, and then either T-wide for touch wide or T-narrow for touch narrow to switch between either the tablet view or the phone view. So you can actually play with these views on the fly. You don't have to exit and reopen Outlook Web App. Just go up to the address bar and add that onto the end of the URL, hit enter, and you'll see OWA automatically change to that view and so forth. Now, one thing I will mention, when you are in that T-wide view, that tablet view, you don't have any folder management. So if you like to create folders and things like that, you would actually have to dynamically switch the view on the fly in order to have UI access to do that. That is pretty much the one thing that doesn't show up as you're navigating through these views. That folder management just isn't there in the T-wide view. All right, let's talk a little bit about calendaring. We've done a lot of work in calendaring, particularly around logging, to give you better visibility and better diagnostics into what is actually happening with appointments. Because, as you all know, it can be very, very frustrating when your calendar's messed up, or maybe when you're showing up for appointments and no one's there, or people are showing up for appointments and you're not there, and so forth. So we've done a lot of work around calendar logging to make things much easier for you to understand what's going on. And we've also lessened its impact on the system. We used to change the logging period. We used to store all those logs for 120 days. Now we're only storing them for 31 days. So you can go slightly more than a month back in time and see those logs. We do have quotas that you can put on the logs as well. If you don't want them to grow too long, you can add quotas to it using both the set mailbox and set mailbox database commandlets. We don't expose the logging values there, but you can still set them that way as well. And then we also have new commandlets like get calendar diagnostic log analysis, and that will analyze the results that would come to it from the get calendar diagnostic log commandlet itself. So if you're running into any calendar issues, you could run the first commandlet and then run the analysis commandlet against it, and it will analyze everything. So the logging detail really allows you, it really gives you the visibility into what's going on. It allows you to learn what client did the last operation on an item, learn what action was taken. Did they reply? Did they forward? Did they accept? Did they delete? Did they edit? And so forth. They can view the history of a calendar item. So if somebody has edited a calendar item, you can go back and see the history, see what's changed, for example. You can quickly pivot on a lot of the well-known properties that make up a calendar item, like the organizer, the attendees, the location, the subject, the date and time for starting and ending of the meeting, and the time zone information if that's present, and so forth. And of course, it also allows the user to quickly access a full set of properties as well. And this is really useful in a lot of real-world scenarios. I mean, imagine the scenario where an executive shows up for a meeting, and they're the only one there. And so the executive complains, so you go and you collect all of their calendar logs from the organizer of that meeting and one attendee. Because you don't want just the organizer's logs, you also want to see what the attendees view of that meeting as well. So you go get the organizer's logs, you get the attendees log, and then you run that analysis commandlet that I mentioned earlier. Once you run the analysis commandlet, that'll generate a timeline and show you exactly what happened. So in a case like this, you might find out that that executive actually manipulated that item, a single instance of a recurring meeting using some device, and that device ended up deleting the entire series. And the logs will tell you exactly that when that happens. This is very, very useful in real-world scenarios. We've also done some enhancements around the calendar repair assistant. So even in the absence of people complaining about mistakes in their calendar, there's still this calendar repair assistant that is running at all times in the background and looking to try and fix things up. If it sees a discrepancy, for example, between an organizer's meeting and the meeting of one of the attendees for that meeting, it will reconcile that and fix that up, typically snapping the attendee's meeting to what the organizer says. But we've done a lot of work to make it much more robust. And because of the architectural changes that we've made, namely that everything now goes through CAS and only CAS talks to Mailbox, we've changed the way the calendar repair assistant works. It is now web services based. So just like a lot of the other protocols, it's going to be making web service calls through CAS to get into the mailbox to read the calendars. It's not just going into the store and doing things across the store anymore. We don't allow that stuff to happen anymore. All right, let's talk about transport. I know Ross did a fantastic session on the transport architecture. I did want to bring up a couple new things that are kind of interesting. One of those things is queue velocity. How many of you have heard of this yet? Just 2 hands. Okay, great. So queue velocity is new in Exchange 2013. This is how we measure the effectiveness or the efficiency of the queue. Or put in simpler terms, this is how we figure out how fast messages are coming in and going out. Obviously, a queue velocity, the ideal queue velocity on a queue that is actually getting and receiving messages would be 0. That would mean messages are going out as fast as they're coming in. Queue velocities that are less than 0 simply mean that messages are not going out as fast as they're coming in, and the queue is starting to build up. So when we look at queue velocity, we're actually tracking 2 rates, both the incoming rate and the outgoing rate of the messages. So what it looks like, for example, is this formula. This outgoing minus incoming equals velocity. It's a very, very simple formula, but it doesn't necessarily tell you the full story because you also have to look at message count as well. It can be a little bit misleading if you're just looking at the velocity values themselves, because if the message count is really high, well, that might explain why queue velocity is a little slow. But if the message count is really low and you have a high queue velocity, that may be a problem that you need to investigate and look a little bit further in. So, what does it look like? Well, queue velocity is exposed only through the commandlet, so you'll see it only when you're using the get queue command. And so what you can actually see if you look up here on the screen is you can see this new column that we have in the center called velocity. So over here I've got 2 servers, EX1 and EX2, and they have all these different queues that are available with different status and different message counts. And server 1's doing pretty well. It has a queue velocity of 0 for all of its queues. But server 2, it looks like it's having a little problem. It's got a negative queue velocity there. And again, that simply indicates that messages are going into that queue faster than they are coming out. But again, it's not just enough to look at the get queue. You also want to look at the message count rate as well, because that will factor in and tell you right away if you actually have a problem that you need to deal with. Now, one thing about getQ, it does work with 2010 and 2013. It does not work with 2007. So if you are in a coexistence environment and you have 2007 and 2013, you'll actually have to use the Exchange 2007 System Manager in order to manage the Exchange 2007 queues. You won't be able to use getQ on a 2007 server in a 2013 environment. Now, the queue logging is actually enabled by default, and it's non-configurable. So this is something that's hard-coded in there, and we're going to be continuously logging this information. And the transport service is taking a snapshot of the queue once a minute. So every minute is when we're logging what the results of the queue is. That cannot be turned off. But you can examine the queue log files. We log them to that directory that you see on there, and that records any queues with messages, including internal queues. If there's queues that are empty, or if they have poison messages, and of course the hidden queues like the shadow queues and the safety net queues we don't expose. But all the other queues, we will log information for. And you can see the long list of information we got. It's very, very rich and detailed information that just looking at one of these log files will give you a great picture as to what's happening on the transport stack on your mailbox servers. So things like the next hop, the message count, the incoming and outgoing rate, the next hop connector, and so forth. All of this rich information at your fingertips at the logs. And again, unfortunately, it can't be turned off, but we kind of don't think it should be because it is very, very useful information to have. Now, here's an example of what one of the queue log entries look like. And I will direct your attention over to here where we're getting the error message here, and then all of a sudden it says attempted failover E with the quotes. That's not a typo in my slides. That's the actual queue entry. And the reason it's cut off like that is because the queue entries are actually limited to a maximum of 54 characters. And so because of that, we're going to try and get as much of an error message as we can, but we're only going to get really the first 54 characters in that queue log entry. So if you start to see things cut off in this log, that is normal and expected. Don't worry about that. It's just a limitation that we put in the queue logs themselves to limit the amount of data we're storing in the file system on your hard drive. And if you actually look through all the logging directories, you'll see there's many, many directories from all the other components that have many, many log files in them as well that also represent rich and detailed information. All right, how many of you are doing discovery and compliance type work with Exchange? All right, so let's talk about some of the cool things that we've done there. So let's first talk about search. So I've noticed there is some confusion about some of our prerequisite requirements for Exchange 2013 around search, namely with respect to the Office Filter Pack. As you may know, with Exchange 2010, the Office Filter Pack was required. You could not install Exchange without it because that was where we got the iFilters so that we could do content indexing in transport, and it's also where we could do the search functionality as well. So now with Search Foundation already includes a superset of all of the filters in Office Filter Packs. Now, Office Filter Pack does have two filters, though, that Search Foundation doesn't have, and that would be the OneNote and Publisher files. So if you have a need to index OneNote and Publisher files, then you will want to put the Office Filter Pack on your Exchange servers. If you don't have that need, then just using Search Foundation natively is fine. Setup will generate a warning, though, if it's not present, but that's not a big deal. It's just a warning. It's not going to block you from going forward. But be aware, because Setup generates a warning and considers it a prerequisite, we also consider it a prerequisite from a documentation standpoint. So TechEd says it's a requirement as well. But technically, from a code standpoint and from a functionality standpoint, it's only necessary for you if you need the OneNote and publishing indexing features inside of Transport. Now, we do also support third-party iFilters as well. We do not support custom iFilters, obviously because we can't test them. But third-party iFilters, like for Adobe, for example, we can't support those. But in this case, Adobe was probably the poor example because we do natively support indexing the PDF format without including the Adobe iFilter. But that's typically the example that we use when we talk about that. Now, in terms of search and message attachment processing, it's important to notice that there are some limitations on what search can do. It is possible that as things are going through content indexing, that not everything may be indexed successfully. And the most common reasons are there's too many attachments, there's an upper attachment limit by default, or the nesting is too deep. It's maybe an attachment and a message and a message and a message, and we're going too many levels deep. Or processing is disabled for whatever reason. So you can actually go into the registry and configure some of this behavior. So if you look at the bottom here, we've got 4 registry keys that we list. One is the max attachment count. Now, the default is 10, but if you're in an organization that's sending around way more attachments, you might want to go and up this, because by default, we will only index a maximum of 10 attachments per email message. In terms of nesting, that's max attachment depth. So we will only go to a depth of 2, which basically means the message inside a message. If you have a message in a message in a message, that's 3 levels. You would need to change the registry entry and go deeper. For processing, if processing images is set to 0, it's on. That's the default, but you can disable it and turn it off. And then mark skipped images as partially processed. That default is also 0 as well. You can go and manipulate that if you want partially indexed items to go back and get re-indexed completely as well. So you've got control over a lot of this stuff. Now, for those of you who are doing e-discovery, since Search Foundation is new, it also brings with it a new keyword query language. And that is what we call KQL. That actually stands for Keyword Query Language. So Search Foundation uses some of the same expressions that you're used to for some of the searches that you might be doing on Bing and other search engines, but some of these expressions might be a little new to you as well. So what I've done is I've got a cheat sheet here that I've given you so that if you are going to the SharePoint eDiscovery Center, or if you're going to the Discovery Center just in Exchange, if you don't have SharePoint, this is the language that you would use for doing your eDiscovery searches in those UIs. Okay, and again, it's not going to be the same language that you would use in Exchange 2010 or that you might use for other search queries. This is keyword query language, and it's maybe a little different, although it looks somewhat similar to what you've used. But again, this little cheat sheet should help you get started in terms of the more common ways of searching across your data in your environment. All right, modern public folders. So I know there were a great number of hands for those of you who said you didn't want to use modern public folders, but for those of you who do, modern public folders are very different from what we had in 2010 and earlier. Okay, they're mailbox-based for one thing. There's no public folder database, no public folder replication. It's all just a type of mailbox in a mailbox database. There's also no multi-master model anymore. In all previous versions, you could have a writable copy of folder 1 with content 1 in there, and a writable copy of folder 1 and content 1 over somewhere else, geographically distant. And you could have merging come in and reconcile multi-master changes that were made in those 2 different places. We don't have that model anymore. We just have the one writable copy that exists in one mailbox, on one database, on one server. Now, of course, because it's a mailbox in a mailbox database, you can replicate it in a DAG just like any other mailbox database and get high availability for it that way and redundancy and protection for it that way. But it's not multi-master. Just like the mailbox, it's active-passive. Nobody's talking to the passive. That's just a replica. Everyone's talking only to the active, and that applies to the public folders as well. Now, public folders have their different type of replication mechanism. They don't use public folder replication, which was SMTP based. Now we use incremental change synchronization. And basically what we're just doing is we are replicating and syncing hierarchy changes. You can have multiple public folder mailboxes in your environment. One of them will have a writable copy of the hierarchy. All of the rest of them will have read-only copies of that hierarchy. But anytime the hierarchy changes, those changes need to be intercepted, sent to the hierarchy mastered, and then synced across all of the other public folders that had that read-only copy. The reason we have the read-only copy is because we want to get a user to that public folder tree as soon as possible, as quick as possible. So every public folder mailbox has a copy of the tree. Only one of them is writable, though. Now, we talked about the ability to roll back. Robert talked about that in his migration session yesterday. It is difficult to roll back, but it's not impossible. And it could be prone to data loss, but if you do it right, you shouldn't lose any data. But the challenge is, it's a cutover migration. Legacy public folders and modern public folders don't coexist. They can't coexist. So at any given time, you're working in one or the other. And once you lock the legacy public folders, all of your work is now being done in modern public folders. And so what that means is if you decide you don't want to use modern public folders anymore and you want to go back to the legacy ones, you have all this data that you may have created or changed in the new paradigm. And that data will have to be extracted from your new public folders and basically exported and imported into the legacy ones after you switch back. So it can be done if you want to. You could go back, unring the bell if you will, put the new data that you've created and fork it back into the legacy public folders if that's what you want to do. But just be aware you could be prone to losing data if you don't do it properly. Now, couple limitations that you want to be aware of. The content inside a public folder mailbox is not indexed from an e-discovery perspective. So as an Outlook or Outlook web app user, I can certainly go in and use the search functionality, but when I'm using e-discovery is not searching public folder mailbox as well. Keep that in mind. That's very important from a compliance perspective. Also, retention policies cannot be applied to public folder mailboxes as well. So even though public folders are a type of mailbox, they're slightly special and a little bit different from your normal mailboxes as well. So they do have some caveats. We also don't allow you to do cross-force migration. So a public folder migration has to be within the organization itself. All right. Couple other things. I want to give you some command lines that you can use for managing public folders. So one of the things that you can do is make sure that any given public folder mailbox in the org has an up-to-date copy of the hierarchy. You can use the first commandlet to get that information. And if you want to get a list of the public folders that only have content in your organization, you can use the second one to do that. Be aware, though, if you're on RTM, the second one won't work. It only works in CU1 because that resident folders parameter that you see there was added in CU1. So it cannot be used that way in RTM. But it's a great way to find out which public folders are actually in use and which ones aren't. If you need to move public folder between mailboxes, you can do that. Okay, because you get to decide how large one of these public folder mailboxes is going to grow to. You decide when it's full. Maybe that's 1 gig, maybe that's 10, maybe that's 25. You get to choose. And when you're ready to move data between public folders, maybe bring up a new one and start moving the data around, you can do that. However, be aware that by default, subfolders are not moved. So if you just specify to move a folder, and that folder is a parent of multiple child folders, only that parent folder is going to move. All the children folder are going to stay put unless you do what I've done in this example that you see up there, which is list all of the individual folders separately. So using the folders parameter here, you can see I'm moving not just folder 1, but also folder 1/child1, which is a child of folder 1. One other thing to keep in mind, only one move request can exist at any given time. So what that means is if you are moving a huge chunk of data between public folder mailboxes, you'll need to wait for that request to complete successfully before you will be able to initiate another move and move more data over to another mailbox as well. Okay, so keep those in mind. Public folders are very good in many scenarios in Exchange 2013, but they do come with some caveats and a few limitations that you want to be aware of. Now, let's talk about managed availability. I want to go through the commandlets. Ross was great in talking about the architecture and the way things work, and even though his demo didn't go exactly the way he had planned, I thought it showed really well what managed availability was doing. But I also wanted to cover just briefly the basics and then kind of flip Ross's demo on its ear and work it backwards, if you will. So the primary managed availability commandlets that you'll use are the get health report, get server health, the monitoring item identity, which is get or set, the server monitoring override, and the global monitoring overrides as well. Now, we have done some changes in CU1. It used to be in RTM, you would use get server health, and then you would take the information from server health, and you would pipe it to get health report. That turned out to be, from an RPC standpoint, very inefficient. So we actually gave get health report the ability to go do its own RPCs and get its own information that way as well. So now really get health report is going to be your best way in CU1 to get some of this rich information out. So here's some examples of what you can get. So for example, I could get just the health report on one server. I could get the health report on a server, and then I could roll up all the health sets into groups, so I don't have to have this very long list of items, and it will be a very long list if you're not doing roll-ups. I can also get all of the health report rolled up for all of my servers in a database availability group, which is what you're seeing in this last one right here. And then also, if a health set is unhealthy, you can use get server health to find out why. It will interrogate and it will show you all the items in that health set, and it will list whether or not they're healthy or unhealthy. And of course, if any one of them is unhealthy, the whole health set is considered unhealthy. So you may have 20 or 30 things in a health set where 29 of them are healthy and one is unhealthy. The health set would be considered unhealthy, and you can use that commandlet to drill in there and find out why. Now, managed availability, as Ross showed you, logs everything into the Crimson channel, into that special area inside the Windows event log. So everything that we do from a recovery standpoint goes into this managed availability recovery actions event log. And when you see event 500, that means a recovery action has started. When you see event 501, that means the recovery action has completed. And you can look in this log, and I bet any of you running Exchange 2013 today could go to your logs right now, and you could open this one, and I guarantee you'll probably see at least one 500 and 501 in there, because again, managed availability is just constantly doing all these things and correcting all these things behind the scenes. So, how can you get the recovery actions? Well, here's one way to get them out of PowerShell. You can actually scrape the event log and get your list of all the recovery actions. And of course, you can do things like add date ranges on there and so forth, and really limit things and so forth. You can use the events in the above format that you see here, but I much prefer using PowerShell's native XML format. So I usually stick on the next command as well, so that I can use the raw XML, because the way that we write the managed availability information into the event log, viewing it in the XML file, in the XML version, even in Event Viewer, actually exposes more data than seeing it in the text version as well. It'll show you all the information about that managed availability component. So some of the useful properties, I'm not going to go through all of these. I just wanted to include them for completeness for you. There's a lot of properties that you can glean from looking at the XML view of those events. And when Ross was doing his demo, all he wanted to do was just demonstrate how managed availability would restart the replication service when it wasn't running. So I thought I would take things from the backwards approach, and that is, I've just come in and I'm wondering, why did the replication service restart yesterday? Well, I can very easily, using this command line, I can find out what exactly requester caused that restart to occur. So when I run this command line, I look at the start time, and I see that the requester here is this Service Health MS Exchange REPL Endpoint Restart. Now, the name is actually self-explanatory if you understand Exchange. It's telling me that it couldn't communicate with the communication endpoint for the replication service. Because the replication service wasn't responding, it restarted the service. Okay? But let's dig a little deeper here. What responder was responsible for that? Well, to get my responder definitions, I can go ahead and again scrape the event log using PowerShell to get my list of responders. Because all the responders, just like all the probes and the monitors, when the health service starts up, they all log exactly what they're configured to do inside the Crimson Channel event logs. In this case, the responder definition log. So I can use the first one to get the responder definitions, and then because the other one was the Service Health MS Exchange REPL Endpoint Restart responder, I can find out which monitor triggered that using the second command as well. And so what I end up finding out is that the alert mask, which is the name of the monitor, is the one that you see here. I'm not going to say the name, it's too long. But you can see what it is under there. Okay, so now we know the name of the monitor. We're, again, working backwards through the responder. Once we have the name of the monitor, well, we want to look at the monitor definitions, because the monitor definitions will start leading us to the probes that triggered this monitor in the first place. So again, the first commandlet that you're going to see up here is going to get me those definitions out of that monitor definition event log. Once I have the monitor definitions, in this case, we know what monitor it was from our prior slide, and so I'm going to use the bottom commandlet to find out what probe caused that. And when I do that, I can see that here's my 3 probes. There's a probe that checks the server locator to find out where that replication service is. There's a probe that checks the RPC endpoint for the replication service to make sure we can make RPC requests into it, which is very important for all things DAG related. And there's also the more basic one that is TCP related that tells us whether or not we can make a TCP connection, which basically tells us whether or not the service is up or not. And because one of these probes, or perhaps all of these probes, failed, that triggered the monitor, which detected that the problem needed to be recovered, which then invoked the responder, which simply started up the service that was found not to be running. So if you're wondering why things happen, work the problem backwards through the event log and through these PowerShell commandlets, and it will, like a detective trail, take you right back and show you exactly what happened and why. Now, you can also get probe error messages as well. So when a probe does encounter some sort of error, we also log those as well. And again, we log them in the probe result event log inside Crimson Channel. And not only can you get an XML view, but the second one, we can also pipe that to out-grid view and get a very nice graphical interface as to what that looks like right there. Okay, so that's pretty good. We can look at this probe here. It says the task RPC listener check through an exception. We couldn't make an RPC connection. And then below that, you can see that the task RPC listener check through another exception as well. So we simply cannot make an RPC connection. The replication service is simply not running in this case, and we can see that by examining the probe error messages. Now, one thing I want to mention, managed availability and journaling. Managed availability, again, is sending a lot of messages around, and if you're using global journaling, those messages are going to get captured, and they're going to go into the managed availability, or into your journal mailbox, rather. Now, there's two workarounds for that. One would be to use journaling rules instead of global journaling. The other would be to add a local, a server-based, or a global override. We've just recently published a knowledge-based article that shows you how to do that. So you can go to that KB. Unfortunately, there was a typo in that KB that's in the process of being fixed. When you look at the commands that we give you to run, one of the commands is a version number based, and the version for Exchange 2013 CU1 is 629.20. And what we've accidentally done is substituted a 5 for X6 in there. So that's about to be fixed. But you can look at the version number for the command before and the one after and get the correct one that way. All right. Two quick issues I wanted to tell you about that are under investigation. This is an Outlook web app coexistence issue when you're running 2010 SP3 with Exchange 2013. What happens here is that the user tries to go to Outlook web app using the HTTP to HTTPS redirection. They get the logon page and they enter their credentials, but that redirection unfortunately doesn't work, and then they end up not getting things rendered properly. And then the very last thing I wanted to mention was this scenario here. Again, a basic HTTP to HTTPS redirection issue. That OA URL module that we used to have in Exchange 2010 doesn't work for redirecting from HTTP to HTTPS. So that is also something that is under investigation as well. If you happen to be running into either of those two issues, I wouldn't mind hearing from you in email about that as well as part of our investigation. All right. So with that, that's actually all the time we have. I'm actually a minute over, unfortunately, and I apologize for that. But I do want to welcome you to visit the resources. I hope you enjoyed this session and got something out of it. I will be at the booth, of course, later today and this week to answer any questions. And, of course, don't forget to fill out your evals and try to win some prizes. So thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the show.